There is a point where success becomes something else, where an athlete stops being judged only by performance, stops being measured only by wins and losses, stops being evaluated only as a competitor, and slowly becomes something larger. A symbol, an idea, a movement. And that's where things become dangerous, because athletes are trained to carry pressure. They're trained to handle expectations. They're trained to perform. But very few athletes are prepared for what happens when people start expecting them to carry something bigger than themselves. A city, a fan base, a sport, an entire future. Sports history is filled with great players, champions, icons, legends, but every once in a while, an athlete arrives at exactly the right moment. Not just talented, not just successful, necessary. And when that happens, something changes. The conversation changes, the expectations change, the pressure changes, because the athlete is no longer competing alone. They're carrying hopes that were never entirely theirs to begin with. That's part of what makes Caitlin Clark so fascinating, because her story isn't simply about basketball, at least not anymore. Somewhere along the way, she became a symbol for growth, for attention, for opportunity, for the future of women's sports. And whether that's fair or not, it changes everything. The strange thing about symbols is that people stop seeing them as people. Not intentionally, but gradually, without realizing it. The athlete becomes the conversation, the athlete becomes the headline, the athlete becomes the debate. And every success feels larger. Every mistake feels larger. Every decision feels larger. Because people are no longer reacting to one person. They're reacting to what that one person represents. And that's an enormous burden to carry. Because symbols don't get bad days. Symbols don't get tired. Symbols don't get overwhelmed. Symbols aren't allowed to struggle. People expect symbols to remain symbols all the time. But athletes remain human. No matter how famous they become, no matter how important they become, no matter how much attention follows them, they're still human. And that's one of the most interesting contradictions in modern sports. The more successful an athlete becomes, the less people sometimes allow them to simply be an athlete. Every game becomes evidence. Every performance becomes a statement. Every interview becomes a headline. Every reaction becomes a story. The spotlight just never turns off. And eventually, the athlete becomes trapped inside a narrative much larger than the game itself. Now, this isn't unique to Caitlin Clark. Icons often become larger than their sport. Michael Jordan, Tiger Woods, Serena Williams, Muhammad Ali. Athletes whose influence eventually stretched far beyond competition. But what makes these moments so fascinating is that the transition is rarely obvious while it's happening. One day they're simply athletes. The next day they represent something larger. And from that moment forward, their careers are experienced differently. And that's because expectations become impossible. Some people expect perfection. Some people expect leadership. Some expect inspiration. Some expect transformation. Everyone wants something. Everyone sees something different. Everyone believes the athlete belongs to their version of the story. And that's where pressure evolves into something much heavier. It's not performance pressure. It's identity pressure. The pressure of becoming an idea. The pressure of becoming a symbol. The pressure of carrying expectations that no individual could realistically satisfy. And maybe that's why so many iconic athletes eventually describe fame the same way. Not as excitement, not as success, but as weight. The weight of attention, the weight of responsibility, the weight of being watched. The weight of knowing that millions of people have attached meaning to your existence. And that's difficult for anyone, especially when your actual job remains incredibly simple. Play the game. But that's the challenge, because the world rarely lets symbols remain simple. The more visible they become, the more complicated everything becomes around them. The athlete becomes a mirror. People project hopes onto them, frustrations onto them, dreams onto them, arguments onto them, and eventually the athlete becomes the center of conversations they never intended to join. Maybe that's why these stories are so fascinating, because they reveal something deeper about sports. Sports aren't just about competition. They're about belief. People don't just follow athletes. They invest meaning into them, meaning about themselves, meaning about the communities, meaning about what they hope the future can be. And occasionally, one athlete ends up carrying more of that meaning than anyone realizes. And that's the weight of a league. Not points, not rebounds, not statistics, expectation, attention, responsibility, visibility. The invisible pressure that comes from being larger than the game itself. And whether that's fair or unfair, history shows it happens again and again. Because every generation eventually chooses someone to symbolize its future. The only question is whether that person ever asked for the responsibility. And maybe that's the lesson. The most powerful athletes are not always the strongest, or the fastest, or even the most talented. Sometimes they're simply the athletes who arrived at the exact moment people needed someone to believe in. And once that happens, the game is no longer the only thing they're carrying. Because some athletes carry a team. Some athletes carry a city. And every once in a while, an athlete ends up carrying an entire sport. And that's a weight few people ever truly understand.